Hello everyone and welcome to another video commentary. In this one we're going to talk about current issues in epidemiology. Also, what is epidemiology? Well, it's not exactly what this class is about, but it is an important field of study in terms of public health and health communication. So this video is going to cover a couple of different things. What is epidemiology and what's wrong with it? So the what's wrong with it part could apply to a whole lot of different parts of science. We're going to be doing a little bit of a synthesis here, kind of combining a couple different perspectives to see if we can identify some issues in the scientific community at this point, mostly from the perspective of what it's like to be one of us lowly humans on the face of the earth trying to be healthy. So let's get into it. So what is epidemiology? Here's a couple definitions for us, one coming from the CDC and one coming from an epidemiology textbook, an older one. This one was on my dad's bookshelf for a number of years because he was a toxicologist and used to teach epidemiology and biostatistics. But let's compare these two things. So the CDC's most recent, I guess, definition is the study of distribution and determinants of health-related states or events in specified populations, and the application of the study to the control of health problems. So we can see an emphasis on controlling health problems, not just studying them. We compare that to this other definition from the textbook. The epidemiology textbook is pointing out that it can be studied in many different ways. So epidemiology can be thought of as one of the ways in which disease, injury, and clinical practice are studied. The scientific study of disease can be approached at four levels, of course. This is the submolecular or molecular level, such as cell biology, genetics, biochemistry, and immunology. The second level would be the tissue or organ level, such as anatomic pathology. The third would be the level of individual patients, or clinical medicine. And four, the level of populations, specifically epidemiology. So we're seeing this emphasis on that population level. However, the textbook then points out that perspectives gained from these four levels are related, and research should be coordinated among the various disciplines to maximize the scientific understanding of disease. All right, so now that I've read those technical definitions to you, I'd like you to process what that means. Right? So we're talking about the study of disease, particularly in populations or at sublevels throughout the human body or in clinical practice to see what their effects are at the population level. The goal being to help with the control of those health problems. We all on the same page so far? Well, that's great, because modern epidemiology might not be. I might be picking on it a little bit this time, but let's get into it a little bit deeper and see what I mean by that. Let's extend this thinking into looking at the distinctions raised by Pierce, 1996, an older article but still relevant, and you're about to see why. So here we have a comparison between what Pierce calls traditional epidemiology and modern epidemiology. Modern, of course, being around the time when I was 10 years old. But what you see here is a comparison between the two. We have motivation of traditional epidemiology being primarily public health and preventing diseases or dealing with them. Whereas modern epidemiology, Pierce argues, is more focused on the science of these things. And so one is happening at the population level, one is happening more at the individual organ, tissue, and cell and molecular level, right, within the body or within society. The context is different as well. So now, arguably, this is good that we have an increased emphasis on science. However, what we see with science, and this will be evident in the second reading, is that it is sometimes overly sterile in the sense that it strives for precision and objectivity. However, that can be a problem if it ends up being too reductionist. That's one of the criticisms that Pierce is raising here. So by focusing on smaller and smaller areas, that's what we would call reductionism. Sometimes that's necessary to isolate effects, such as if you're exposed to this contaminant, you will have these health effects. We want to know that through clinical trial, science, positivism, well, these days more post-positivism, but we want to know that as clearly as we can. But in order to make that information relevant for a public health perspective, we need to be aware of a couple of issues of levels of analysis, some fallacious reasoning sometimes, and the pitfalls of statistics. Let's see if we can break this down a little bit more. So essentially, the contradiction here that Pierce was pointing out back in 1996 was that the traditional epidemiology has to do with big trends. Big trends for the sake of reducing the impact of health issues in the population. Modern epidemiology tends to focus more on individuals. Now, that's happening in two ways, both within the individual body, but it's also happening in terms of the focus is more on the individual. That means some of the individual responsibility would be the ideal, but what ends up happening sometimes is something like victim blaming, or at worst, well, that's probably the worst part, but ecological fallacy is another fancy word. Let's talk about those things. So these issues that Pierce are pointing out, this is coming right from the abstract. So you don't have to dig too far into these articles to find their central arguments. Pierce is saying that this reductionist approach focuses on the individual, blames the victim, and produces interventions that can be harmful. Those are pretty strong claims, and they're worth our consideration, and certainly worth asking if this has gotten better or worse or stayed the same over time. So this indicates a shift from kind of the original goals of epidemiology, from the macro, again, population level, down to the individual. Now, we do want individuals to be healthier, but epidemiology with its public health perspective is supposed to try to keep the population healthy, the whole country, for instance. This shift could thereby be interfering with the central goal of disease prevention. Now, I've mentioned this word before. I don't know if I've mentioned it too many times in my other videos, but it's always prominent in my mind. We have this thing in statistics and biomedicine known as the ecological fallacy. Ecological fallacy means we are looking at trends that happen at a big level, and we're attributing them to the individual level. My concern, and I believe that Pierce and both Ioannidis and Pierce would share this concern, is that when we confuse those levels of analysis, we could be running into some trouble. So for one thing, this happens, for instance, like in a completely non-medical example, with stereotyping. Right? We see a big group, and then we attribute perhaps group level trends or observations, even if they're fallacious. And we meet someone from that group and we say, because you're part of that group, you have those characteristics. Well, that's an easy cultural example of how this kind of bias can occur, how this kind of fallacy can occur. But we can also commit this statistically by measuring big level trends, such as we do in epidemiology, and then saying, okay, because I see these big level trends, because I see a lot of drinking in that community, which might be associated with cancer or other health ailments, and you drink a lot, that means you will have cancer and those other ailments. That's an ecological fallacy. It's not always true. It doesn't take into consideration a lot of important stuff, namely social context and individual characteristics. That's what Pierce is trying to point out for us. So an ecological fallacy is drawing inferences about individuals from the population level, and it doesn't take a whole lot of imagination to see how that can go wrong. Now, of course, part of that is baked into epidemiology, and part of it's necessary because we are trying to look at big trends and we are trying to help individuals be healthier. We can do this better though. So now if this was and continues to be occurring, that's bad news in the sense that, well, for instance, if we are victim blaming, right? Individuals might be differentially affected by, say, environmental contaminants. You don't really have much control of whether or not your water supply is contaminated or your food supply is contaminated. And so by shifting epidemiological focus to the individual too much, we might say, hey, you better change your dietary practices or you're going to get cancer. When in reality, it's like, okay, well, first of all, if it's true that I would get cancer from this thing, I don't have control over how much of that thing is in my water supply. I don't have control of how much glyphosate is put on my wheat before it is harvested. And so that's one of those potentially harmful aspects of this that we say, all right, you, the individual, there, it's your responsibility. All right, now, meanwhile, we'll keep handing out these subsidies to these people who are polluting your food supply, right? that would be a problem here. This is a problem that Pierce was pointing out all the way back in 1996. There were a lot of eco-minded movies and pop culture things happening back in the 90s as we're recognizing the impact of pollution, but we're still unpacking a lot of that today, and that's good. We just want to make sure that we're doing it as honestly as we can here. All right, so is it any better? Well, here's a slightly more recent article. This is coming from the 2000s. We've already looked at Ioannidis when he was talking about cancer stuff, right? He was looking at diet and he was saying, okay, if we're going to trust dietary research, everything gives you cancer. Everything, right? That's a similar problem that Ioannidis was pointing out at that point, which we've already discussed. But I want to draw our attention to this again because we see something similar sometimes in modern science and epidemiology and public health. So in that example, you may recall the cookbook study where they took 40 random ingredients from the cookbook, looked at the literature, and they found most of them had cancer associations. But that's probably not realistic, right? When you're looking at these big data trends and you break them down and you break them down and you continue this reductionist approach, now, albeit in a statistical way, that's still reductionism. We're breaking it down, breaking it down, breaking it down, trying to isolate the effect of this one little thing. The effect may not be that big, but it could be statistically significant. And then once that kind of thing makes its way into a headline, we say, oh, this thing causes cancer. And then people keep studying it and they're like, oh yeah, we can find a teeny tiny bit of cancer if we study this salt hard enough, right? Yeah, that's the key, right? If you study it hard enough, you can find an effect. That doesn't mean it's meaningful or impactful for your health. And that doesn't mean it's meaningful enough to enact countrywide policies, for instance. But here we're seeing something similar. Ioannidis is making a similar argument. I know that this one was heavy on the statistics and methods here, but I'm going to try and break it down according to the main things he's talking about. So do we see similar issues as he's describing in the dietary research as is cautioned against by Pierce 10 years earlier? And now here we are 20 years later, and we might still see some of these same problems. But do we see those similar issues in what Ioannidis is talking about? In this article, he's mostly talking about statistical issues more than the social issues. So remember that Pierce was talking mostly from a sociocultural perspective and saying, we have a problem if epidemiology gets too reductionist, and in doing so, it ignores all this context. If you're from an impoverished community, if you're a manual laborer, you might be smoking more, that kind of stuff. Sociocultural. Ioannidis is talking more about specific problems with research and conducting it. Those issues are low statistical power, as I just described, right? We might be able to detect an effect. Maybe it's not statistically significant. Or the other way around, this last one of over-reliance on things like p-values, well, that would be, it's statistically significant, but maybe it's not meaningful. So we've got both errors. Some things are statistically significant and not meaningful. Some things are meaningful but not statistically significant, kind of. And then we also have bias that's baked into the system due to the reaction to these trends, right? The scientific community, people publish what is advantageous for their career. They study what is advantageous for their career. And if they've got some kind of claim, maybe many false positives could be sensationalized, such as like, oh, well, alcohol is basically giving you cancer. Never mind the fact that the study that's saying that is studying a lot of cancers that are associated with smoking. But alcohol is also, people are drinking and smoking at the same time, but that's not the same as saying that the alcohol is causing the lung cancer, for instance, right? So there's that kind of stuff happening too. That creates a bias in the research. You may be noticing that Ioannidis is quite the curmudgeon. He really likes to point out these issues in science, and I think he's right to do so. So even though Ioannidis is talking about these statistical issues more than social issues, we still see this kind of overemphasis on the individual level. Not just individuals as like us people trying to be healthy, but also on this like microscopic granular view that ends up reinforcing weird perspectives on the literature. That could still be causing problems for us. Now, I do want us to, I think the easiest way to tie this stuff back together is to bring it back to the victim blaming idea. So if we are suffering environmental contaminants, if we're suffering pollution in our food supply, if we are suffering a variety of health issues, there's more going on than whether or not you as an individual are eating right. Now, of course, you should take responsibility and eat as healthy as you can, but you could eat a completely vegan diet and still be exposed to a lot of pesticides. So if those pesticides are the harmful things in our food, guess what? No amount of individual choice, other than being a carnivore, I suppose, will fix that. So that's what we mean when we say individual, like victim blaming. Individual responsibility is, of course, very important. And that's part of what this class is talking about is, well, what can we do with this information to make ourselves healthier? Epidemiology has to balance these different levels of analysis. And that's very important to remember. Let's look at an example. Another COVID example, I know, but it is relevant. It's recent and it's demonstrating the issues of both what Pierce and Ioannidis were complaining of. I know I harp on this a lot, but it is important. It's just the most relevant example. I will try to keep it short though, so we won't be going into a ton of depth, but I do want to demonstrate how these kinds of things that both Pierce and Ioannidis are talking about can scale up to real world problems that you yourselves have already lived through. So, step one, we have a problem with low statistical power, false positives, and limited clinical data, which was used to establish the group level trends in the population. So there weren't a ton of studies about these efficacies of these different interventions. There wasn't very reliable data about how the cases were actually surging. Some of that got muddied. Some of it was real. Some of it was sensationalized. There was a real pandemic. There was real stuff happening. And a lot of this can be probably attributed to error, not malice. So I want to say that at the outright. Nevertheless, these are issues. So the kind of group level trends were established using limited data. Sucks. That's the way it is when you have a pandemic that comes out of nowhere, arguably. In the most charitable interpretation, this caught everyone by surprise. And so there was a lot going on and it wasn't totally clear. As people were saying on the news all the time, well, the science is a moving target, it's always changing. That's correct. Nevertheless, that data, the limited data, was used to establish those group level trends. That's step one. Step two is that those group level trends were then used to justify sweeping policies that were, step three, applied to pretty much everyone. That ignores human nature, first of all, assuming that you could get people to stay inside away from other human beings with no contact for more than 2 weeks at a time. It's probably not a very safe assumption. It also ignores stratified risk, that people suffer differential risk from these viruses. Young children don't suffer the same risk as adults your age or older adults. It's all different. That's called stratified risk, and it's a public health essential. So you can see a recipe for disaster there, and the rest is history, right? You have resistance from various people. You have all political parties leveraging this for their own political gain. You have people using the confusing nature of the whole situation for social and fiscal profit. This kind of stuff did, in fact, happen, and it's still controversial. If I posted this video even a year ago, it would probably have a flag. It might still get a flag about like get COVID-19 information because it technically is questioning the narrative. But it's questioning the narrative along the findings of epidemiology and public health. So I hope you find that useful and interesting. At the very least, we can think about this implication for us. Again, not to shake our total confidence in the systems that be, but to season them with a bit of rationality as we look at perhaps sensationalist headlines and move into the future. So conclusions for you as individuals and students in this class. Science isn't perfect. Anyone who says so, they don't know what they're talking about. It is a process by which we approximate truth to the best of our ability. When it's working properly, that's what it's doing. Scientists are people too. We have limitations, we have our biases, and when the system creates a situation where we're incentivized to act on biases and not great data, well, guess what's going to happen? Scientists aren't perfect either. Not being perfect also means it's not infallible. I know that that's kind of a roundabout way of saying it, but like we're not talking about, the truth of the cosmos being channeled through, God or something here. We're talking about our best approximation of truth. That is a process by which we arrive at that information. And we should use it appropriately. We should see the data that comes out and we should say, that's an interesting finding. That could very well be an association. I'm not totally sure about that, but let's look into it further. Let's look into it further. Let's investigate further and better understand these things. That's what we need to do. What I want you as students in this class to be aware of are things like I think are best captured by this idea of the ecological fallacy. We take those big level trends and we put them on the individual. Doesn't always work out that way. Individuals have variability. They have different characteristics and stratified risk. We can use those big level trends to try and figure out what's going on. But as you've just seen, it is a delicate balance to say, all right, what's happening at the group level? Well, we certainly want to have a clear picture of that. And then we need to respond to those big level trends appropriately for those different groups based on stratified risk, for example. But this is an example of how science ain't perfect, y'all. We have to be aware of that. And that doesn't mean you have to distrust it, but it does mean that we should take that information with a grain of salt. So at the individual level, what can we do about this? Well, there's a lot of things that we can do about it. We do know a lot about what keeps us healthy. We do know a lot about the things that we do that harm our bodies and that don't. We do have to take control of our own health where able. But also that doesn't mean taking responsibility for the whole world's health. That's not really realistic either. I don't know. Maybe we're not getting too helpful for you individually, but I do want you to be aware of these trends. It's kind of up to you now to think about what you can do with those lessons. I hope you don't lose faith in all of these systems, but recognize that they are not monolithic. These are not impenetrable walls that you can't understand, access, or anything else. You can understand these things. You can access it. You can learn about it. It takes a little bit of critical awareness. Thankfully, you're reasonable adults. All right, that's all for this commentary video. I hope I'll see you next time.